This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. Last time I ended with the key conundrum, which I think exists in what I would call the longue durée. And this conundrum is that the continuity of human life is threatened by the means required to procure endless capital accumulation. And that if we consider the continuity of human life to be more important than the continuity of endless capital accumulation, then we need to start to think about ways to totally restructure our economic life and to create an alternative economic model which satisfies human wants and needs at the same time as it doesn't threaten the continuity of human life. Now, at the very outset, I'd like to say that posing this problem in a way which I would want to think is rational and not built upon some sort of apocalyptic vision coming out of religion or something of that kind. It requires an analysis which highlights the nature of this problem, and that is the kind of analysis I tried to construct last time. But when I go to the literature in general, I don't see any analysis that points really clearly in this direction, in the way that comes out of, for example, the way Marx structured his understanding of how capital works. We do see particular issues like the environmental issue and so on, which are highlighted in the literature, but most of that comes up against the problem that almost all economic theory is oriented to the question of sustaining and maintaining economic growth. In other words, economic theory is built upon creating the continuity of that endless capital accumulation, which is doing exactly taking exactly the wrong path in terms of preserving the continuity of human life. Now, I watch Bloomberg News Channel, which is, I think, really very interesting in this regard. That the day-long discussion there is all of these different asset managers and so on are constantly kind of sort of trying to predict how much growth is there going to be, where's the growth going to be, can we position our assets in such a way as to take advantage of this particular growth. In other words, there is never, ever a discussion or a gloomy thought attached to reviving economic growth. If the growth signals are strong and everybody says we've got 3 or 4% growth looming, everybody on Bloomberg News seems immensely happy because this is creating all kinds of opportunities to increase the value of their portfolios and all the rest of it. Similarly with politicians. I mean, politicians constantly kind of say, we are going to be the ones who revive growth. Donald Trump, when he came to power, kind of said, we are going to just push the economy up to 3 or 4% growth. We really are going to have the tax cut is going to produce 3 or 4% growth. When it didn't do that, he kind of said, well, we haven't been there long enough. Give me another 4 years and you'll get the 3 or 4% growth. But the promise of 3 or 4% growth is constantly on almost every politician's lips. And the public never sees that in a negative light. In other words, the public, when it's told that there should be a more economic growth, sees immediately that this means more jobs, it means more money, it means more this and that. Maybe they can get more of it, though in fact, in practice, most of the people don't. But on the other hand, you can hope for more of it because redistributions usually come out of growth, and if there's growth, then maybe we'll get better off. So this growth mania is almost a fetish belief which prevails across the whole of the economic spectrum, and of course is heavily embedded in the way in which economists typically think about it. In other words, the economists themselves don't seem to be perturbed at all by the prospect of exponential growth. In fact, they look at the curves and they see the curves moving exponentially and they kind of say, yeah, this is good. Maybe it's going too fast, which is overheating in some area, and therefore we have to try to curb it. So the Federal Reserve should put the brakes on the economy. Or as they like to say in financial circles, they're going to take away the punch bowl just as the party is beginning. So they recognize that there's speculative waves and they try to control that. In fact, economics is organized as a mode of understanding which cannot get to the sort of understanding that Marx set up, because economics is a science that is shaped around things, and in particular factors of production, so that the three key factors of production are land, labor, and capital. And you put those three together and their marginal utilities fusing together creates a certain supply-side price, which then is put up against the utility of commodities to holders, and you get an equilibrium. So the economists are constantly focusing on equilibrium. They realize that departures from equilibrium can signal a crisis, and they become quite expert at tinkering with various parts of the economic system to try to keep the economic system in equilibrium. So there's a continuity of growth, but they cannot see the damage which is going to be wrought by the sort of compounding growth which comes out of understanding that spiral form which Marx laid out in Capital, and which is coming into its own since the 1970s onwards, as Capital starts to get into that upward swing in the exponential growth curve, where the growth rate becomes so serious that something has to be done about it. Now, this kind of question is one in which the absorption of the mass and the rising mass becomes very critical for understanding where crises might come from. Now, this is one of the questions that happens within Marxism itself. There's been a lot of literature in Marxism about the tendency towards a falling rate of profit. The rate tends to fall because technological change tends to be labor saving, and if you employ fewer laborers, and laborers are the source of value and surplus value, then you're actually cutting down on that input which produces the value and the surplus value and underpins the profit. So there is a tendency for technological change, other things being equal, which of course they never always fully are, but other things being equal, this will lead to a falling rate of profit. So there's a lot of discussion about that, and therefore the falling rate of profit is seen as, if you like, one of the main series places in which there's likely to be crises in a capitalist economy. My argument, however, is that Marx wasn't only interested in the falling rate, he was also very much interested in the rising mass. And in fact, in Volume 3 of Capital, he says, the law I wish to look at is the dual law of falling rate and rising mass. In Marx's time, the rising mass did not play such an important role, and I think it's quite right that there should have been much more attention paid to the falling rate. But the rising mass is now absolutely critical, because that is where the exponential growth is now felt most strongly. And if there is no capacity to absorb the rising mass, then we have a huge crisis. If we absorb the rising mass, we're likely to have a crisis of another sort, which is an environmental crisis in particular, but also social and economic crises, the stress on populations, and the incompatibility of freewheeling daily life with the tensions which go being embroiled within the capitalist dynamic of instantaneous consumerism and therefore the conversion of daily life into one kind of consumerist process. So economics then is not very helpful in the current situation, and politically we find ourselves more and more in a situation in which the left, unable itself to come up with an economic theory which will explain where the stresses are coming from and why they're coming from the place where they come from. Absent that, the left is left in effect with simply looking for ways of reordering the existing capitalist system to get away from the worst aspects of neoliberalism to what sometimes is referred to as a more ethical capitalism, a more responsible capitalism, a more environmentally friendly capitalism, and the like. In other words, the problem is not deemed to be capitalism, and in fact, to say that capitalism is the problem is in fact to be assaulted immediately by the far right, and not only the far right but also the centre right, as somehow or other being in favour of an alternative kind of economy which is about dictatorial constructions of collective action. Now, my argument here is this, that there is no way in which we can deal with the current dilemmas without strong attachment to collective forms of action. And the collective forms of action have to take a variety of channels. Now, many people will kind of say, are you talking about a total revolution of everything, which is unfeasible? And the answer is, no, I'm not necessarily talking about that, but I am talking about the movement of steps towards some sort of economy in which the profit motive is reduced. In other words, what neoliberalism did, precisely because of the processes that I'm talking about, is it opened up all sorts of areas for commodification and profit making, which were not there before. Consider, for example, the field of education. Up until 1970 or so, the cost of education was manageable. But what we've seen is the increasing privatization of education worldwide. And to this degree, education became a commodity. And we started to see the emergence of for-profit aspects of the education. Not necessarily in education itself, because most of the educational institutions would call themselves non-profit entities. But just think about the ancillary areas of economic development. For example, textbooks, production of educational materials. This has become big business. Now, the same applies, by the way, to healthcare and the like. In other words, the commodification of many areas of social life, which occurred under neoliberalism, was a sign that capital was finding difficulty in defining areas in which could absorb the amount of capital which was looking for profitable outlets, and so you needed to create new markets. And I think it's interesting that even carbon emissions got turned into a carbon emissions trading and carbon emissions market. In other words, you marketized everything. And you did so not because it was a good idea, but because, or because it was more efficient, because that was the argument, but because you needed to create new markets for everything. Now, if that was the case, and we've been through a period of 40 years of creation of new markets, then one of the things we could start to do is to say, all right, we're going to work on a trajectory of decommodification. Decommodification, but not necessarily decommodification which entirely abandons the market. Let me give you what I think is a very interesting example of this, which I encountered in some of my own work. In a city like Quito in Ecuador, most of the food supply comes through markets in the city. And the markets have stalls in which the direct producers come into the city early in the morning carrying their produce with them to the stalls. Now, the direct producers are largely the indigenous population, and they leave around, I don't know, 2 or 3 in the morning or something like that, and they get into the city at around 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, having walked however many miles with their produce, and they put it on a stall, and there it is on a stall, and I go in there and I decide that I'm going to use something when I need the fruits, or I need the peas, or I need the potatoes, or whatever they are, and I will purchase them. Now, this is a market transaction, but on the other hand, it's not a capitalist market transaction, because the providers are not capitalists, they're petty commodity producers. And the commodity comes in and it's exchanged against my revenues. So capital does not circulate through that market. In other words, that market is organized in such a way that it is a non-capitalist market system. And it doesn't face the same problems of profit and all the rest of it. Yes, the people bringing the commodity in will want to make a living out of it, but they're not caught up in sort of investing whatever profit they make in the expansion of their activities. They're just on a daily basis trying to earn enough money to buy the commodities they themselves will need in order to survive at a better standard of living. So you find a petty commodity structure. Now, I'm not going to say this is all very beautiful, because it's very hard work. The porters bringing the commodities into the city on their backs, very hard work indeed. I mean, they're bent double, they have huge amounts of produce on their backs. And I'm not saying that the work out on the land is easy, or in fact, some of it is quite hard. But on the other hand, my point here is not to kind of say and come up with some romantic view of how great this all is, but to say here is a system of providing food to the city, which is commodity production and commodity exchange, but it is non-capitalistic. It is not capitalized, and big capital is not involved. Now, you compare what is going on in the markets with what is going on in the supermarkets. In the supermarkets, you have a big, highly capitalized commodity chain, Maxi supermarkets or whatever, or Super Maxi supermarkets. You go in the supermarket and, of course, you buy goods, but you can also buy vegetables, and you can buy fruits and all the rest of it. But those fruits and vegetables come to you through a capitalist agricultural system. It's odd that in Quito, of all places, you can go into the market and you'll find the tomatoes there, and they come from Holland. You'll find the celery there, and it comes from California. And in other words, a lot of this is imported goods coming from capital-intensive and industrialized agriculture. And that industrialized agriculture is high-tech, but is also a great consumer of fossil fuels, and a producer of greenhouse gases, and you name it, and all the rest of it. And at the same time, when I go into the supermarket, what I'm doing is I have my revenues, I've got from my salary, and I'm going to spend it on consuming something which is put into the market through this capitalist process. So you have two forms of market provision. One is petty commodity production through indigenous producers, which is also local and has a strong element of what we refer to as food sovereignty in it. And then you have the supermarket system, which is not local, a lot of it. Some of it is, but a lot of it's not local. And a lot of it is coming through a capitalistic system, which is highly intensive, is using a lot of fertilizers, and you can see the whole structure. So you have two structures of food provision. Now, which structure is being favored by government policies? And the answer is that the markets are under assault. They're under assault from local governments. They're not supported by local governments. In fact, the markets are being allowed to deteriorate because, to some degree, the government seems, I don't know if it is, but seems to be more favorably inclined towards the large supermarket chains than it is towards the small indigenous producers. Even though it has a rhetoric of how important small indigenous producers are and everything, it is not actually prepared to act by that rhetoric. One suspects, of course, that the big financial power of the supermarket chains has a political use and has political influence, so you can go down that channel too. But here is a situation where, given the kind of analysis I've laid out, you would want to do as much as you possibly can to support the petty commodity producers against the supermarkets. And in fact, you would want to get rid of the supermarkets, if you possibly could, by expanding the structures of the indigenous markets. We do see some of that going on. Even in New York, there are farmers' markets, but to be honest, some of those farmers' markets sometimes seem to me to be part of a capitalistically organized enterprise rather than indigenous and food sovereignty and all the rest of it, which is the sort of thing that I would want to encourage. Now, what I'm saying here is that there are forms of production and provision which do not lock themselves into the capitalist exponential expansionist logic which prevails in the rest of the economy. And what is appalling to me is the way in which those areas which are of that sort are increasingly giving way to capitalistic structures. And what we see is capitalistic structures also locking onto things which are often called sharing economy things. I mean, look at how quickly Uber or something like that, which went from a sort of a sharing thing, or how Airbnb, which was kind of seen as a sharing thing, gets capitalized, taken over by big capital, organized by big capital, and that then makes for a different kind of economy, which is caught up in this logic of exponential expansion. So the exponential expansion is actually pushing into these areas in such a way as to make exponential expansion even worse. In other words, there's a sort of a feedback effect, a feedback loop, as it were, that the more you go for exponential expansion, the more exponential expansion you have to have in order to support it. And we see this in other ways. For instance, just back on the supermarket case for a moment, if you're going to import food from outside, then you need foreign exchange to buy it. Where's the foreign exchange going to come from? Well, in Ecuador, what are you able to sell? There are some raw materials you can sell. You have an export of shrimp. You have an export of cut flowers. You have an export of cacao. You have some export industries, but they're probably not anywhere near big enough to support the sort of supermarket import of foods in the way that is currently evolving. And what this means is you have to go elsewhere, and you've got lithium resources or rare earth metal resources in the south of Ecuador. You've got oil resources in Amazonia. So you start to actually have to earn foreign exchange by opening up to the country to extractivism of the worst sort. So again, what this says is that we really need to rethink the whole of our economic structure, not necessarily about saying, okay, we're not going to trade anymore, we're not going to have money anymore, we're going to have a moneyless economy, or we're not going to have petty commodity production, but that we are going to do everything in our power to get out of that high-tech, high-capitalized logic, which is producing the exponential growth curve, which is so threatening to humanity in our present time. So it is not necessarily a total revolution that we're calling for. There may be at some point the need for some more total revolution in which nobody is going to work with the capitalistic logic, and we're going to actually tax the capitalistic logic out of existence. But the difficulty with that is as follows. That whereas, again, go back to Marx's time. In Marx's time, very few people required integration with this capitalist logic in order to have breakfast upon their table. But it's now the case that almost everybody in the United States, almost everybody in Europe, almost everywhere, everybody increasingly in China and Japan, depends upon the capitalist logic in order to put breakfast on the table. That is, that this system, which has got set up, has become so pervasive and so influential, it's so embedded in our ways of life that we find ourselves very difficult to actually imagine what the alternative might look like. I am not going to say that there has to be some catastrophic way in which we push towards alternative. We may actually experience something like that in the not too distant future. That could happen. But what I'm in favor of is saying, look, there is a need for a long durée transition away not from neoliberal capitalism, but away from capitalism in general to an alternative way of meeting human needs and wants and restructuring daily life around a different cultural logic to that which is set up by contemporary forms of consumerism, by contemporary forms of monetization, and by contemporary forms of thinking. And here we get round into the psychology of things. I recall not so long ago asking some young students, a bunch of them happened to be around and I was having dinner with them, what their ambitions were for the future. And they all kind of looked a little confused. And then one of them says, well, I just want to make some money and have a good life. And everybody said, yeah, that's all we want to do. And I was a bit shocked. Because I guess I came from a generation where people said, well, yeah, of course, having enough money and living a good life's a good thing. But on the other hand, I want to be a doctor, or I want to be a scientist, or I want to go do stuff which has to do with mountains or dogs or whatever. So people had a more specific kind of ambition. But when the only ambition is to earn money, then you're going to find people just going off and earning money doing anything, no matter whether it's ethically good or ethically bad. In other words, the whole kind of questioning of what it is we're doing in our daily lives and how we're doing it. And I'm not going to sort of say we should be constantly going on and on about this and saying whether we should use a plastic bottle or not use a plastic bottle and bring it down to some sort of level of moral judgment which becomes totally repressive. But I'm thinking about a more open kind of recognition that a long-distance transition is necessary, and that when we think about the long durée and think about what's going to happen over the next 50 years, we look at environmental conditions, we look at air pollution conditions, we look at plastic pollution conditions, we look at the tensions of daily lives, which are kind of going to be wrecked by speed up. We look at all of those kinds of things and say, look, we need an alternative economy. The intuition which is around, which is correct and very strong, that our economic system is not working for us. That recognition is, I think, absolutely critical, but we have to understand why. And it's the questioning why which contemporary economics and contemporary thinking is not doing a good job of probing at all. And that is, it seems to me, what we should be doing and what we should be thinking about. Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production. A special thank you to the wonderful Patreon community for supporting this project.